Well, we've talked quite a bit about the interaction between the English colonists and Native American Indians that they encountered in the 17th and 18th century. Now let's take a little bit of a closer look to something that we've briefly mentioned already, and that is the French interaction with Native American tribes in what was then the western frontier. Well, that interaction was primarily centered around the fur trade. That was the goal that the French had in North America, was to establish and maintain that trade with the native tribes. The French in the Great Lakes area allied with the various Algonquin-speaking tribes, whereas the English took over the Dutch obligation to have a treaty alliance with the Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee. So the Iroquois and the Algonquin tribes were natural enemies, and the English and the French were natural traditional enemies. So it's no surprise that they kind of lined up in that way, and particularly in the Great Lakes area, in what today would be considered the Midwest, particularly Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. That whole area was a center for the fur trade, as well as farther north into Canada. And that area in particular, in the Midwest, has been referred to, beginning with historian Richard White in the 1970s, as the middle ground. And essentially what that means is that there in the Ohio country, the Ohio River Valley country there in those and the upper Mississippi, the French and the Native American people living there, particularly the Algonquins, which was most of them, they got along really well, and they sort of mixed freely together to the extent that there was not a clear-cut border between the area where French settlers were and the area where Native Americans were. Unlike in the English colonies, it all just kind of blended together because the Europeans, particularly in this case the French, they just interacted very freely with native tribes, and vice versa. And this whole area of the Midwest that's been called the middle ground was a place where there was a lot of that mixture going on. It became really, really commonplace. And because the French had such a different approach than the English, in North America at least, because their goals were different, the Indians in the region who allied with them really found the French a lot easier to get along with than they did the English. As this map shows, the French influence extended way beyond the range of the Ohio country. As you can see there, of course, all along the Mississippi River down to New Orleans. That's no surprise, I'm sure, to you. And up into Canada, this is their influence in the fur trade. Now, up in Canada, to the north of the French, there's a big section controlled by the British. That had been controlled by the French until the early 1700s, when, in the various wars between France and England, those regions had been taken away from France. But they're still there in the middle ground along the Great Lakes, but also westward of there into the Great Plains, the Northern Plains, and the Northern Rockies. Now, there were not as many French trappers or French citizens in general out there on the plains and especially up in the Rocky Mountains, but there were quite a few. And tribes from that region, Native American tribes from the Northern Plains and the Northern Rockies, they encountered and became familiar with the French many, many years before ever they encountered any English or American trappers or traders or citizens. In fact, that that influence can still be seen when Native American individuals from those tribes are in the news even into the 21st century. For example, David Archambault, who was I think that he has been replaced since then. I think there's another election, but David Archambault was for quite a while the chief of the Standing Rock Sioux. And if you're familiar with what was going on in Standing Rock in 2015, 2016, you'll know that he was in the news a lot. David Archambault and Leonard Peltier, whom you may have heard of, very prominent member of the American Indian movement, who's been imprisoned for about 40 years after a shootout between the American Indian movement members and the FBI. He is Ojibwe, but also of Lakota ancestry. And, of course, the Standing Rock Sioux also are Lakota. So French names, you'll often see Native Americans from the Dakotas, from Minnesota, from Montana and Wyoming, who instead of having English surnames, like a lot of Native Americans do, they have French surnames. So that's how that came to be. Well, throughout the area, I'm talking about from the Ohio country there, Indiana and Illinois, westward to the plains and the Rockies. Those French-Canadian trappers who interacted frequently with the Native American tribes were called a couple of different names by the French. One was coureur de bois, which if you ever hear someone talking about coureur de bois, they're talking about French-Canadian fur trappers. That literally means runners in the woods. Also, sometimes they are called voyageurs, and of course the English pronunciation of that, voyager. There's a big statue in Minnesota called, it should be called the Voyageur, but people pronounce it Voyager. When we hear the word voyage, we think of a sea trip, but in French, voyage simply means a journey. So voyageurs were travelers among the Indians, who, unlike most of the English colonies in the areas that we've talked about, not only interacted, generally speaking, in a more positive way with Native Americans, but started to, much more quickly than the English colonists, to, instead of trying to force the Indians to dress like white people or to have white people names or to imitate European culture, they sort of blended in with them the same way that there was a general blending of interaction in the middle ground, which is to say that these French trappers were more likely to become more like Indians than they were to expect Indians to become more like them. Now, by the way, not in every case, but frequently in the 1800s, well, from the 1600s to the early 1800s, French-Canadian trappers could be identified by the fact that many of them wore red knit hats or scarves on their heads, like these guys here. If you saw someone with this type of headgear, even before you talked to them, you'd have a pretty good idea they're probably French. And that was portrayed in the novel Centennial, which I assign in my environmental history class, and which was made into a TV miniseries back in the 70s with the character Pasquinel, played by Robert Conrad. So I highly, highly recommend that book, by the way. So just examples of how the French interacted more smoothly with the Indians, won the loyalty of their Indian allies more easily than did the English, who tended to be much more likely than the French to seem condescending toward their native, even their native allies. Well, what's going to happen when we introduce English colonists into that mix there in the Ohio country? Well, we get to find out in 1750. And this story is about as westward expansionist a story as one could imagine. The Ohio Company was established not in Ohio, because Ohio was controlled by the French and their Algonquin allies. Rather, the Ohio Company was established in Virginia. There had been, as I mentioned, there had been several different wars over the previous century between the English and the French that had been fought in whole or in part in North America. And as I mentioned, there had been French territories in Canada that had been taken away by the English. That area to the north that we looked at, and also Acadia that I think we may have talked about earlier. So English colonists, people living there in the 13 colonies, were increasingly confident that eventually their government, which at this point was England, was going to fight the French some more and take away more of their land, particularly there in the very desirable Ohio country. So this Ohio Company was a company formed by investors, essentially land speculators, who were gambling that England was going to get that territory, take it away from France, and they wanted to be in on the ground floor when that happened to be able to buy up as much of that land as possible to resale for a profit to other English colonists. Well, this Virginia-based company that wanted to do this included several prominent individuals from that colony, the colony of Virginia, including a guy named Thomas Lee, whom you may have never heard of, but you've heard of his family. The Lee family was very prominent in Virginia. This was an ancestor of Robert E. Lee. And then a guy named Peter Jefferson, whom you've probably also never heard of, but he happened to have a son, a young son at this time named Thomas Jefferson, and the Washington family, including young George Washington. Actually, his older brother was more in charge of the finances, but young George Washington was in on this as well. So they wanted to have access to the country that, the territory that they believe will be taken away from France. And they're kind of motivated time-wise to do this because another company gets formed in the colony of Pennsylvania with the same purpose. And so the Virginia company wants to get out there to Ohio before the Pennsylvania company does, so they can start mapping out the country, which they hope will be taken away from the French. The French immediately take note because what they do is they send a team, Virginia, the company, along with a contingent of Virginia militia to protect the surveyors, is sent into what is today Ohio, despite the fact that that is not English territory, it's French territory. And the French take note. Remember I said there aren't as many French people in those occupied areas under their control as there are English people in the English colonies. But once they become aware of this large number of English colonists from Virginia tromping into their territory, why, there's a lot more French people there because the French army up in Canada is sent down to be on the standby, see what these folks are up to, and basically tell them that they're not welcome. Well, here is a map of the relative quote-unquote possessions of the colonial powers. The red there along the coast, those are the 13 colonies, 13 English colonies. The blue is the area controlled by France, which we just looked at in a previous map, right? It's much of Canada, and all up and down the Mississippi River and around the Great Lakes. Of course, the orange there, those are areas that are under the control of the Spanish. The purple areas, those are the places that had previously been under French control, but in recent previous wars had been taken away from the French by the English. Now, you look at the amount of ground the French colony, the colonies of Nouvelle-France in the north, or Canada and Louisiana in the south, they cover a lot more ground. They have a lot more geographic territory. But there are many times more English colonists living in that tiny sliver of red than in that whole area controlled by the French in blue. Well, I said this is as westward expansion as you can get. They're gambling that the English possessions are going to expand westward into Ohio and take that area away from the French and, of course, their Indian allies. Well, that militia that was sent by the governor of the Virginia colony to accompany to basically do a surveying expedition was commanded by a young man named George Washington that we mentioned earlier. He's 21 years old, a major in the Virginia militia. By the way, if we were in person in a classroom, I would ask for a show of hands, so I'll just have to make this a rhetorical question. How many of you know what George Washington did for a living outside of occasional military service and outside of owning a plantation? Why, he was a surveyor. So that's what he's there for, to survey the Ohio country. And the French, as I said, they're not too pleased with this, so they send a large number of troops down there to prevent the Virginia militia from going any further into their territory. And the Virginia militia, commanded by Washington, attacks those French troops and is promptly defeated by them and forced to retreat. They retreated, and they built, well, to call it a fort is kind of a stretch. They just put together the best defenses that they could and called it Fort Necessity, because it was absolutely necessary they not be killed by the French, and tried to hold off the French who were attacking them again, and once again they were defeated and actually captured. After they were captured, they were paroled. Now, you're familiar with that term today. Parole is what happens when you're in prison and you're let out of prison early rather than serving out your whole sentence, with the promise that you won't break any laws, and if you do, you get sent back to prison. Well, that's not exactly what we're talking about here. The word parole is a French word. It is the French word for word, parole. So, in a military sense, now this continued. This was a common practice among European forces, and continued to be a common practice even among American forces until about halfway through the Civil War. Parole means that if your troops are captured by the enemy, instead of putting you in a prisoner of war camp, they will let you go and let you go home if you give your parole, if you give your word, your solemn word, that if they let you go, you won't participate in the fight against them anymore. So we promise you, if you promise you won't fight us anymore, we'll let you go. Well, that didn't necessarily work out in this case, because Washington was involved in the fight that followed, and a big fight followed. The war, is known as the 7 Years' War, and it really was something that took place around the globe. The English and the French were going at it in a big way, the biggest way that they had in a long time, and they're fighting one another in North America, where it started. Major Washington's little expedition is what started this war. And they're fighting one another In India, they're fighting one another in other areas around the world. In North America, to the English colonists, this war was called the French and Indian War. Now, I remember when I was in high school, just to see if anyone had done the reading, the history teacher went around the room and asked everybody who won the French and Indian War. And no one had done the reading, and so some people were saying the French and some people were saying the Indians. That's incorrect, because the French and the Indians in this case were on the same side. It was the French and their Indian allies against the English, who also had some Indian allies, but not as many. The French had all the Algonquin tribes, which included the Ojibwe or Chippewa, the Ottawa, the Wyandot or Huron, and many, many other tribes. England had on their side the Iroquois. The Catawba tribe from the Carolinas, and at the beginning of this war, the Cherokees. But that didn't last. It only lasted until 1758 for reasons that we will see later. So, war starts, and the first really big battle is in 1755, the Braddock Expedition. This was a contingent of British troops accompanied by American colonists. And in these cases, often the British, they had their red uniforms. The American colonists who served under the British often had blue uniforms. Edward Braddock was in command. Major Washington, George Washington, was his aide-de-camp, or his adjutant, his assistant, basically. By the way, one of the wagoneers, one of the, we would call them teamsters later on. Later, like, World War II, and even today, there would be the truck drivers. One of the wagoneers was a young guy from Pennsylvania named Daniel Boone. Spoiler alert, we'll see him again. They encountered the French and their Indian allies near the Monongahela River in Fort Duquesne, which would later be called Pittsburgh. And the English forces were roundly defeated. Braddock was killed. Washington managed to escape with his life to fight another day. There was another incident that took place in the New York colony at Fort William Henry. And what happened here was that the French commander, who was this is probably the most famous, most effective of the French generals in this war, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, and his Algonquin allies surrounded the English Fort William Henry, and demanded the surrender of the English. And the English, seeing themselves outnumbered, immediately surrendered. And when they did, the French offered them parole. That is, give us your word, you won't join in the fight against us, we'll let you go. So we're going to take over your fort, but we'll send you packing, and you can go rejoin your English people. However, the native allies of the French, of General Montcalm, didn't respond well to this because they didn't really understand that way of fighting. They had joined in the fighting so they could fight, and so they could win honor and distinction, prove themselves as warriors, which was very important in their culture. Also, so that they could share, essentially, in the booty of the things that were captured. But mostly they came to fight, and they weren't used to the idea of calling off a fight because everyone was just too agreeable and polite. So when the English colonists left the fort, the Indian allies of the French swept down upon them and attacked them anyway. And of course, the English had given up most of their weapons, and so it became a slaughter. The French general, and I think that most historians agree that this is how it played out. I'm pretty confident this is how it played out. The French commander Montcalm tried to Montcalm them down because this was a travesty to any European, but it didn't work because they were ready for some fighting. However, the English colonists didn't look at it that way, and so the way it was regarded throughout the English colonies was that the French had done this on purpose. The French had intentionally tricked the English militia and colonists, and this included civilians and women and children, into leaving the safety of the fort just so they could send their Indian allies down to slaughter them. And that really made people more angry than ever at the French as well as at their Indian allies. Now, shortly after this, the war really took a turn. The first years of the war, the French had the advantage and the French were winning. After this, it started to go the other direction. By the way, the massacre at Fort Henry is depicted in the 1990s movie version of The Last of the Mohicans. It's depicted fairly accurately, actually. All right, well, remember I mentioned that the English had, among their Native American allies, which they didn't have a whole lot of, but that included the Cherokees. But that it didn't include the Cherokees throughout the entire war. Well, here's the story behind that. When the war starts off, Cherokees come in on the side of their English allies. If you remember us talking about the Yamasee War earlier, the Cherokees had come down on the side of the English there. That had helped save South Carolina about 40 years or so before this war. Well, the Cherokees are on the side of the English, and large numbers of Cherokee warriors travel northward to fight alongside their English allies against the French. There wasn't a whole lot of French threat in the southern colonies where the Cherokees were. So they went northward, and in fact, they were at the siege of Fort Duquesne, which was a French fort. And interestingly enough, the English forces included Cherokees and Iroquois, who had been longtime enemies of one another. But now they're kind of cooperating together because they're both siding with the English. The French were defeated at that battle, and Fort Duquesne was taken and renamed by the English for the English Prime Minister at that time, William Pitt, and that's how it became Pittsburgh. So, long story short, large number of Cherokee warriors are at this point, in the late 1750s, in Pittsburgh, where they had helped the English defeat the French up there. Well, that battle is over, that particular campaign is over, and those Cherokees are ready to return home. So they head southward back to their home. Now, officially, the Cherokees and the Iroquois and the Catawba, who were allies of the English, officially they were considered by the British government part of the British Army. They were even paid to a certain degree, not nearly as well as if they were, colonists, but they were part of the Army, and therefore they had all the basic rights and leeway of British soldiers. And among the rights that British soldiers had during wartime as they were defending the colonies was the right to forage, which meant essentially the right to eat, right? So if the British Army is defending you and you're in an English colony, and that army has to eat, you have to feed them. So kind of exercising that right, as the Cherokees were headed back southward, they killed some cattle in Virginia to eat. Well, the Virginia colonists were not looking at things from the same perspective as the Cherokees, largely because the Virginia colonists, like the majority of colonists in all 13 colonies, pretty much hated Indians. They didn't care what Indians they were. So a group of Virginians got together to get revenge on these Cherokees for having eaten some cattle. And what they did is that they ambushed a group of Cherokees who had camped for the night beside a river and swept down upon them and killed them all. Now, the Cherokees, they weren't putting up any, sentries. They weren't expecting any problem because they were firmly in English territory and they were English allies. The colonists not only killed the Cherokees, they scalped them. And the reason they scalped them was because during this war, Europeans on both sides offered rewards for the scalps of Indians allied with the opposite side. So the English government would pay money for anyone who brought in the scalps of any of the Algonquin tribes allied with the French. The French government would pay money for anyone who brought in the scalps of the tribes allied with the English. Well, the Cherokees are allied with the English, and it's English people that have killed them and scalped them and take their scalps into the colonial authorities. And they said, because they know they're not supposed to be killing Cherokees, they said, hey, look at these Shawnee scalps that we took. You should pay us money for them, because the Shawnee were allies of the French. However, the Cherokees had a very distinctive hairstyle. They basically wore their hair, they shaved their whole head except for one spot about the size of a silver dollar on the back part of their head, from which they grew a ponytail. And so it was these ponytails that were cut off. Shawnees didn't do that. No one else did that except Cherokees. So immediately, everybody knew that these colonists had actually killed the Cherokee allies of their own government. Meanwhile, back down in Cherokee country at a place called Fort Loudoun. Fort Loudoun was a fort that was built in the frontier, the western frontier of the North Carolina colony in what is today Tennessee. In fact, it was just outside what today is Knoxville, and there is a Fort Loudoun State Park. If you head east toward Knoxville from Tennessee Tech, it's just before you get to Knoxville that you find the exit for this park at the little town of Vonore. And they have built an exact replica there of that original fort. And you can go visit it, and there's reenactors there. It's really interesting. I highly recommend it. But anyway, this fort was built in Cherokee territory with the permission of the Cherokees, because the English wanted to be able to keep an eye out for French invaders. Okay, that's why they had the fort. Well, many of the Cherokee men had been away at war, leaving the old men behind, and the women and the children. And what had been happening is that some of the junior officers at Fort Loudoun, some of the English lieutenants and captains, had been raping Cherokee women. And when the Cherokee elders came into the fort to protest this, the captain in command, whose name was Desmarais, I believe, Captain Paul Desmarais, he just basically laughed at them and was very rude and obnoxious. So their women are being abused by their alleged allies. They're not happy about that. They're waiting for their warriors to come home, and their warriors never come home because they were murdered in Virginia by other English colonists. And this leads to the Cherokees. Some of the young men who were there, now some of the warriors had successfully returned. There were some that hadn't left, so there's still Cherokee warriors. Some of them, in anger, go out on raids against the English colonists, and this causes a lot of friction. At this point, what happened was that some of the Cherokee leaders asked for a meeting with the governor of the colony of South Carolina at Charlestown, which is now Charleston, South Carolina. And South Carolina was part of the area where the Cherokees were, asked for a meeting to negotiate an end to this friction and try to come to some kind of settlement. Now, the way that the Cherokee tribal structure worked at that time was that every Cherokee town actually had two leaders, one who was in charge of war and one who was in charge of peace. And it was the peace leaders from several Cherokee towns, several prominent Cherokee towns, who came in to meet with the governor. And they brought with them their families, their wives and children. And the reason they did that is because that is a symbol that we are coming in peace. We couldn't possibly want war. We have our families with us. And so that's how negotiating was done among the Cherokees and other tribes. Well, they come in to meet with the governor, 23 individuals with several of the chiefs and their families. And the colonists living in Charlestown, when they saw these Indians coming into town, were outraged and demanded the governor do something to these Indians. And so, feeling the pressure, he arrested these peace chiefs and their families. He arrested them, and he imprisoned them in a fort called Fort Prince George. Well, this was a huge insult to the Cherokee people. Also, maybe something that he hadn't thought about, the governor. He's arrested the peace leaders. Who does that leave in charge? The war leaders of all these Cherokee towns. And so the war leaders got together and they attacked Fort Prince George to try to rescue their imprisoned peace leaders and their families. And when that happened, the Cherokee prisoners inside the fort were put to death by the English soldiers in the fort. They were put to death, and we don't know the specifics. All we know is that a colonist who witnessed it recorded that they were put to death in a particularly cruel and terrible way. So there's really no telling. So there's probably some torture involved with these women and children and peace leaders, 23 people in all. That is not a good way to win friends and influence people when you've already got all these problems. This led to all-out war by the Cherokees upon the English. So what that means, this is during the French and Indian War. So the English are already having to fight the French and their Algonquin allies to the north, and now in the south they're having to turn their attention to fight the Cherokees, who were their allies, down there. Well, over the course of this war, which lasted 3 years, the Cherokees swept through several towns there in North and South Carolina. Tennessee, of course, was not a colony. It was part of North Carolina. And eventually a Cherokee force surrounded and besieged Fort Loudoun. And Fort Loudoun, it was out on the frontier, right? That means they were a long way from help, a long way from reinforcements. The soldiers of the fort tried to hold out as long as they could, hoping reinforcements would come, but reinforcements were not coming. because all the other English forts were being attacked by other Cherokees at the same time. So finally, Captain Desmarais surrendered to the Cherokees, and he was told that if they could keep their sidearms, they could keep their rifles even. They just had to they had to leave their cannon and leave all their gunpowder, and they would be allowed to peaceably leave the fort and go back to the English lines. So these were regular British soldiers and also colonial militia, but also a lot of civilians, because the officers had their families there, and there were civilians who lived at the fort doing things like, the blacksmith, there were laundresses, there was the preacher. So they all agreed to leave. They didn't turn over their gunpowder like they were supposed to. Desmarais turned over a small part of it and buried the rest, which the Cherokees found out pretty quickly. So the people of the fort left the fort, and they traveled a little ways, and then they camped beside a river for the night. And after that happened, Cherokee warriors swept down upon them and attacked them. It was similar to the attack at Fort Henry in some ways, but it was also different. Here's what was different. It wasn't just a wanton slaughter. Several people were killed, including some women and children were killed from among the people who were at the fort. 23 people were killed in all, and the others were let go. Now think about that in context of what we've already learned about Native American culture and the importance of balance. How many of those Cherokees were murdered after they were taken prisoner when coming in under a flag of truce? 23, including women and children. So 23 of these people are killed, including women and children, and no one else beyond that. Also, they're killed while they're camped for the night beside the river, just like those other Cherokees had been in Virginia. So sometimes when I've heard other historians or other professors talk about this incident, they will refer to the Cherokees in such a way as making it sound like they had just done this really craven and dishonest and terrible thing, because from the European point of view, they had. But from the native point of view, they had done what you're supposed to do, right? They took revenge, blood vengeance, for exactly the things that had been done to them and no further. Well, the war didn't last too much after that. The Cherokees lost because the colonial militias swept through and destroyed all the crops in all the villages of the Cherokees, destroyed their crops and their homes, and then there wasn't really any way they could continue resisting through the winter, or their families would starve. So the Cherokees surrendered and had to give up a part of their territory. That was the first time the Cherokees had to give up any territory to the English. So this whole war happened inside the larger French and Indian War. It started after that French and Indian War had been going on for a few years. It ended a couple of years before that war ended. All right. Well, some individuals to mention. William Pitt, I mentioned him once already. He was the English Prime Minister during this war. Also, the most prominent English general was named James Wolfe. Remember, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm was the top French general. Several French forts and settlements were captured and taken over and turned into English settlements, including Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, Fort Duquesne, that became Pittsburgh, Niagara, Louisbourg in Nova Scotia. The Battle of Quebec was one of the most important battles of the war, and the leaders of both armies got killed in that battle. Shortly after that, the Battle of Montreal was the last really decisive battle. It was still 2 or 3 years before the peace terms were drawn up after this. But this was effectively the end of the fighting. The French were decisively defeated in the Battle of Montreal. This, by the way, is a painting called The Death of Wolfe. That is General James Wolfe. I've always found it fascinating to look at this painting and see all the English and colonial soldiers and officers looking on, horribly distraught, as the general bravely dies. And then there's this one, apparently Iroquois guy who's sitting there who seems to be saying, sucks to be you. Anyway, with the end of the war, the treaty was signed in Paris in 1763, and unlike the previous wars in North America between England and France, this one was huge. France lost all of their North American possessions. They still maintained their possessions in the islands of the Caribbean, but they lost both Nouvelle-France in Canada and Louisiana. So the red areas are the areas that were English at the beginning of the French and Indian War, although the Hudson's Bay area had once belonged to the French. All that pink area was French territory that is now English territory. And of course, the kind of gold colored down there, that's the territory controlled by Spain. And then the pale yellow is Louisiana, which is taken from the French and given to Spain. So Spain took over Louisiana in 1763, and they would be in charge of it for several decades. Well, this is the end of the French story, pretty much, in North America, and the beginning, the English colonists hoped, of a wonderful new phase of westward expansion, as they were finally going to be able to move into the Ohio country and that area to the south, which is now, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and etc., because the French no longer control it, and so they're going to be able to go out there and establish their farms and settlements. Except there was one big problem, that is that there were still Indians there who had fought on the other side. But as it turns out, there's another problem facing the English colonists, one that is coming from unexpected quarters.